Now I can go? Well, tonight we have to try something new because I found out I have a feature on my iPad that I didn't know I had. It's came from the new update that we got from them. And so let me see if I can do this. So now as we're doing class, we'll be able to, let's see, take the running back. Can you see it coming up there? And go around. And then the other blockers will come down this way. And so we're going to have Madden Bible class. So actually that should be kind of fun. That's the first time I tried it. I just found out I could do it. And I was like, okay. So, but we're going to be looking at a map a little bit later, so that may come in handy actually. We can have some fun with it. But yeah, when I found out I had that, I thought, oh boy, I can have all kinds of fun. Tonight is class 32. We are starting the book of Judges. So we're going to jump over Judges chapter 1, because Judges chapter 1 is basically, they come into the land, they've been in the land, and then it gives you 3 judges, and they're minor judges. So we're going to skip over them. They don't even get our attention. But you can go back and read them in Judges 1. You'll get Ehud and a few of them. So it's a good little read. But basically, we kind of talked a little bit last week about it, but I want to go into it a little bit more. The period of the Judges is kind of the Wild West of the Old Testament. And Joshua has died at the age of 110. The elders that were with him and the people that were with him continued to serve God and lead Israel following God throughout their lives. And then they died. The next generation comes up, and they didn't have a clue. So you can blame the generation before because they didn't pass it on. They didn't tell the stories the way God told them to do. They didn't pass that information on to them. So you have a generation coming up that don't really know who God is. And what happened was they had come into the land and they had settled most of it. And then they took a break. We're tired of war. We need a little break from war. We're going to take a break. Then we'll go back and finish conquering the land. In the meantime, they had settled in with the Canaanites and the Jebusites and stuff. Some of the places, the scripture tells us that they made the Canaanites basically slaves to them. They put them in bondage, essentially, and had them work for them. Other places, they just intermingled with them. And God told them when they came into the land, if you intermingle with these people, if you just come alongside of them, you are going to be enticed to follow their gods and worship their gods and follow their practices and do the things that they were doing, which were detestable to me. And so that's what Israel does. They come alongside of them, they become friends, they say, hey, these guys aren't so bad. And the next thing you know, the Israelites are worshiping the Canaanite gods. So God tells them, I am no longer going to drive the armies out before you. Now, he told them that he would. But he said, because you are no longer following me, I'm not going to drive them out before you. Instead, I'm going to leave them there as a test for you. You're going to have to choose. Just like Joshua told them when they came into the land, choose this day whom you're going to serve, the gods of the forefathers worshipped, or the one true God. And they then said, oh, we're going to worship God. And God said, well, that didn't work out so well. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave these people there. I'm not going to drive them out before you because you're unfaithful to me. You're doing the same thing they are. How can I drive them out if you're just as bad as they are? So they're going to be a test to you. But not only that, they were going to be an oppressor to Israel. So the Canaanites, in the first few instances, are actually the ones who are oppressing the Israelites. And God allowed them to do that because of Israel's wickedness, because they did evil in the sight of God. And they continually go back and do evil in the sight of God. And so that's what we're going into, is this time when, since they left Egypt, they had Moses, then they had Joshua. When Joshua died, they had the elders and the leaders. And now, they have really no one. And so they're kind of trying to do it on their own. And so these judges were raised up by God to try to bring them back into a relationship with him. They're trying to bring revival back. Now, again, when I say judges, we're not thinking about the person up there with the long robe and the gavel. Kaboom! Not that kind of judge. He's not judging their actions. He instead is the judge who is trying to bring them back into a right relationship. He is working on behalf of God and saying, this is what needs to be done. So if you want to consider it judging at all, it's the sin of the people, but he's trying to be that bridge between the people of Israel and God and bring them back. And so tonight we're going to start off with the story in Judges chapter 2. Actually, it's not really the story in Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2 is going to lead us into the story we're going to study tonight. Judges 2 kind of gives you what I just said. It's the background of how they got in there. It's the story of why this is all happening. And then Judges 2 is where we're going to pick up, and that is going to be where we study Deborah. So we're jumping ahead a few judges. There were 12 judges total that were actually, called judges. Some of them were minor, some of them were major. We know some of the major ones. We're going to study 3 over the course of the next few weeks. The first one tonight is Deborah, the only female judge that we have. The next week we're going to study Gideon. And then the week after that, we're going to study Samson. Those are probably the 3 best-known judges, though there are, like I said, 12. There's actually kind of a 13th judge, and that would be Samuel. He served as a judge, as a prophet, and as a priest. So Samuel kind of gets his own little category, but there were 12 designated judges of Israel over this period of hundreds of years. So in Judges 2, we'll get a background here. It says, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land. See, it's a if. I will never break my covenant with you. I will give you everything I promised if you don't make a covenant with them. But if you make a covenant with them, it releases me from my promise to you. And so it says, but you shall break down their altars, yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? And I have also said, I will not drive them out before you. They will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud, and they called that place Bochim. There they offered sacrifices to the Lord, and after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. So we just talked about that. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, meaning they all died off. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. And Baal is the god of the Canaanites. He was a god represented by the image of a bull, usually, and he was the god of thunder and lightning and fertility and all this kind of stuff. He was the main god of the Canaanites, and then the other gods were below him. But they turned from God and served the god of the Canaanites, which is what God warned them about. And it's because you would think that the Israelites had a cool enough story coming in there that they'd want to tell the next generation. But they really didn't. So we're a generation out from when they crossed over and took Jericho, maybe 2 at the most, and they don't know those stories anymore. They're not talking about the Red Sea anymore. They're not talking about the wilderness anymore. They're not talking about their bondage in Egypt anymore. They're not talking about coming over and conquering Jericho anymore. They're not talking about God driving out the armies before them anymore. And they've just come complacent. Hey, here we are. It's home. And they've stopped kicking the nations out ahead of them, and they've decided it's just easier to become one of them. Their God, our God, it don't matter. Any port in a storm, right? And so if they needed something from this god, they'd pray to it. If they needed something from this one, they'd set up a little altar and pray to it. And they didn't really care. They just became very self-centered. And the thing that we find in these cultures is all these little man-made gods are made because they serve man. Man says they're serving them. I'm going to offer sacrifices to this god for my fields, for my crops, but ultimately I'm serving this god because I want good crops. And it's what that god's going to give me, and that's what it's about. And so they keep changing gods and getting new gods because it's all about serving them ultimately. What are the gods going to do for me? And God says, I will give you everything if you just serve me, worship me, keep my commands, keep my covenants. And yet they're seeking the things that the world offers rather than what God has already laid out before them, to the point of where they don't even tell their kids about it. You know, there's not giving them an excuse, but here's a generation that doesn't even really know they're supposed to be serving God. Doesn't even know they're supposed to be worshiping only him, because that's what they've seen. So it says they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Asherahs. Asherah was his cohort, the female god that goes along with Baal. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of the raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. These are the same nations that God was pushing out before them with no sweat. And then God said, okay, you're going to do it on your own, try it on your own. And then all of a sudden these nations are coming back and they're oppressing Israel, and the raiders are coming in and they're conquering Israel left and right. And Israel on their own is powerless to stop these guys. Especially because the other thing we see here is the tribes start to function on their own. It's no longer the 12 tribes of Israel standing in the gap here to go against the city. It's, oh, here comes Benjamin. Here comes Judah. Here comes Zebulun to fight this battle, rather than being a cohesive force because they have nobody to lead them. They're supposed to be following God. And then God raised up the judges and said, at least follow the judges, and they're not even really doing that. And so they're not a cohesive force anymore. They've become 12 little nations that kind of work together. And it says, whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them. Just as he had sworn to them, they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to the other gods and worshiped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge, and he saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as that judge lived. So there's that thing again. See, here's the problem with the judges. A judge would be raised up, and he would bring them out of the bondage of one of these little oppressing nations around them, and he would bring them back to a status where they were worshiping God. And they did pretty good as long as that God or that judge was alive. As soon as that judge died, over and over it says they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They went back to what they wanted to do. Their heart said, oh, well, I guess we can do our own thing now. We no longer have this guy watching over us or this girl watching over us, whatever. We're going to go on and do our own thing. And that's what we see. So some judges reigned for years, 20, 30, 40 years. Some months, or maybe a couple years, whatever. But each time that judge would die, they would revert right back to their sinful ways. So they were okay as long as that judge was there reminding them. But as soon as that voice was gone, right back into their sin. It says, for the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, all the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I have ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel and to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors did. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. So these nations that they failed to drive out have now become a thorn in their flesh. And God says, just like Joshua, like I said before, like Joshua said, you choose who you're going to serve. The gods of these people or me. But I'm not going to drive them out before you anymore. Matter of fact, my hand's going to be against you because you're worshiping other gods. You don't want anything to do with me, so I'm going to let you do your own thing. And so they were there in this time of the judges. Now, as I said, when you go into 3, you get into more judges. You get a couple, 3 of them, I guess. I said 1 before, but it's actually 3 that lists the judges. 1 is just kind of the closing out of Joshua and what happened there. But as we get ready to go into chapter 4, we're going to talk about Deborah. And Deborah is, like I said, the only female judge, but her role in what is going to happen was, again, to bring the people into account for what they were doing and for what God had called them to do. And we're going to see that they were being oppressed. They were being, overrun, basically. And so God raises up a soldier named Barak. And he doesn't have enough guts to go start the battle. So Deborah, who's acting as a judge, has to go to him and say, dude, get out there and fight. Because that's what God has raised you up for. Get out and do your job. And so he finally does. So that's the story we're going to be reading tonight. But first, we have a map. Dun, dun, dun. Because I have a pencil. That's why we have a map. So anyway, the reason that I put this up there is because it's kind of important to see what we're going to be talking about. The whole thing today, I don't know what color's better. What color should I use? Red? Let's try red. The whole event is going to take place in this area. Okay? So we got a big map for a little bit of area. But this is basically where it is. Now, Deborah is actually from down in this area. But she's being called up to the north because that's where this confrontation is going to take place. And so we're going to see some things. And the interesting thing, the reason I like to circle that is I want to tell you something else about it. And that is this is going to take place around an area that's dominated by Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is this domed mountain that if you're anywhere in the north of Israel, you can basically see this thing for the most part, and you can go, oh, that's Mount Tabor. I mean, it's really identifiable. It's there. But the interesting thing about it, the neat thing about it is this is one of the many battles that take place in the Jezreel Valley, which is just below Mount Tabor. And Tabor sits next to this town called Nazareth. And so when I've been there before, and even when I talk about it now, when I sit there and look at it, I think how it must have been for Jesus growing up in Nazareth as a young man. To be able to walk to the edge of town and look down into the valley and know this is where Deborah was. This is where the armies met. This is where all the Old Testament battles mostly took place. Just around the corner down here is where Gideon, his spring is, and where he fought the Midianites. And just in this whole little area, and it's all within eyesight, even all the way over to Megiddo and all that. It's all right there in that valley. You look straight across from Nazareth, and you're looking at Mount Carmel, and Mount Carmel is this little area right there. It kind of jetties out into the sea. So when you see a map of Israel and you see that little thorn sticking out, that's the end of Mount Carmel. It's a mountain range that runs back into the country. On that is where we have Elijah fight the prophets of Baal. It's in Jesus' backyard. So all this stuff happened right in that area. And tonight is going to be no exception to that. They're going to have A lot of it happened right there, and we'll talk about it as we go on. So, Judges chapter 4, like I said, is the story of Deborah. And it says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. There we go. We're going to see that a lot. If you read through the book of Judges, you'll see that phrase over and over and over again, is they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, Ehud was dead. Ehud was the prophet right before Deborah. He's died, so what do? Go right back to their wicked ways. They go right back to doing the same old stuff. It says, so the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. So we can jump back here, and that is basically about right there. See the red dot? Did it come up good enough? Is that a little better? It's about right there. Right at the base of Mount Carmel, there's a river that runs along the side of that and cuts inland. And that is where he is at. And so it says he's in Harosheth Hagoyim. Harosheth is a Hebrew word meaning skilled craftsmen. Some people say iron workers or smithies. Hagoyim, Goyim, is the Hebrew word for the nations, or nations. And so they're the other people, whatever. So Harosheth Hagoyim is basically the blacksmith shop of the nations. If it had to be done with iron, they had to go there to get it done pretty much. They had that kind of nailed down. And so that gave them a great advantage. Iron. Good stuff. They control it. So it says, because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. That big valley I showed you right there, the part of the Jezreel Valley. Big open flat farmlands. And so in this situation, the Canaanites under Sisera, had 900 chariots with iron on them. The Israelites have 0 that we know of. And so if you've ever watched, the old ancient movie type things, whatever, even biblical type movies, a chariot gives you an extreme advantage. And if they had 900 of them out there on the open plains, a group of people on foot are kind of sitting ducks. You're not going to stop the horse, and you're sure not going to stop the iron chariot. And even with your little shield and sword, you're not getting through that. And so they were basically tanks against a bunch of infantry. And so Israel could not take back those areas because what are we going to do with that? God's not fighting for them. He's not driving them out before them. And so if they go out into the open field, they're going to get wiped out. So Sisera kind of has a bit of an advantage. And they've been oppressed. And it says then, now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at the time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. So that was down there south a ways, like I showed you. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. That's what a judge did as well. They were kind of the elder of the whole thing, so people could come to them and say, we have this problem, and she would say, here it is. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor, again, like I said, is this kind of a knob hill out there. It's pretty steep, pretty tall. It is not just a little hill. It's actually a mountain, basically, and it is a great strategic point. But the thing with chariots is they're really good on the open flatland, not so good in the mountains. They don't have four-wheel drive. And especially a chariot that's fitted with iron. Horse ain't pulling it up that hill. Horse is going, You were heavy enough, dude, but you put all this iron on you? No, I'm good on the flat, but forget it after that. So the Israelites go up and camp on Mount Tabor. It's the safest spot for them to be. They have to stay in the hill country. They set up camp down below. They're kind of, open. But they get up on the hill. So they put 10,000 men up there on the hill. And they get up there ready to get this battle going, because the Lord had called Barak to come and lead this battle. And it says, I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops into the Kishon River, or to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands. He said he's over there by the river, by Mount Carmel. It's across the valley, but you can see it. It's just a few miles over there. And he said, you see that big army massing over there? I'm going to lead them there to the river. They're all going to be massed up there, ready to go for battle, and I'm going to give them into your hands. See, the other thing that God really likes to do with the judges is do something that Israel could not possibly do. Like I said, the craziest thing Israel could do right now is to run down off that hill and get into the flatlands. Especially if the army's all amassed over there by the river, on this side of the river, sitting there in the big open fields, and you go running down there, and all you have to do is go, okay, guys, gear up. Let's go kill us a bunch of Israelites. And they would have cut through, 900 chariots would cut through 10,000 men and no problem. And so they're probably thinking, man, what's going on? This is great. But God said, look, here's his army, here's his chariots, here's his fortress, his forces all gathered up here. I'm going to give them to you in your hands. Not them, God. And God's going to win the battle. Barak said to her, now, this guy, he's a soldier. He says, if you go with me, I'll go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go. He said, I know I'm supposed to take my guys up there on the hill, but only if you go with me. Deborah, only if you come along and hold my hand, basically. Because he's still doubting a little bit. He's like going, are you kidding me? You want me to take 10,000 guys up there, sit up on the mountain, come down and attack this, Sisera's forces? You first. You show me how to do it. And so she says, certainly I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course that you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. She says, okay. You're not doing what you're called to do. You backed out. And this is one of those situations, and I don't want to get into a big debate about it and stuff like that, but there are many times when God calls men to lead and says, step up and do your job. But if they won't do it, God will say, okay, ladies, show them how it's done. Go ahead and do this. Now, spoiler, it's not Deborah that gets the glory. So I know you're thinking, oh man, Deborah's going to be the one to do. No. But we'll get to what it is. But she says, yes, I'll go with you. Why? Because Deborah knew that God had spoken to them. Barak was questioning it. He was doubtful. So he said, are you going to go with me? You going to go stand up there on that mountain against those forces? And she went, you bet I am. She said, I'm ready to go. He says, okay, then I'll go too. And she said, great, but you've lost the glory of this battle. Your doubting, your lack of faith has made it so you're not going to be the one that God can fully use. Had he stepped up to the calling that God had given him, it would have been his glory. Not that he's doing it for that necessarily, but she said that's what you're called to do. And so it also gives us a little bit of an insight when people talk about, God will raise somebody up for a purpose. But that person cannot stop God. So God may raise somebody up for a purpose, but if they don't follow through, God will say, then this person will. I got a person standing right here that'll do it just fine. And so that's what he does. Alters the plans just a bit and says, great, go ahead and lead the army, but the glory is not going to be yours. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zananim near Kadesh. Yeah, say that one quick. Now, Kadesh, there's a couple of different Kadeshes, and I guess I can go back here. We'll go back to the map. There is a Kadesh that is way up in this area, okay? And some people say, so if you can kind of see that map, it's above the Sea of Galilee. It's several miles up above the Sea of Galilee. And there's also a Kadesh called Kadesh Naphtali. Kadesh Naphtali is right down here next to the Sea of Galilee. That's the Kadesh we're talking about. It's about 12 miles from Mount Tabor to Kadesh Naphtali. It's like 30, 40 miles to the other one. So Kadesh Naphtali is what we're actually speaking of here when we're talking about them going to Kadesh. And some people will talk about it again, saying, well, I don't believe that, this is part of this deal because it's so far away. How could any of the army have made it that far after a battle and stuff? Well, yeah, because you're looking at the wrong Kadesh. But if you look at Kadesh Naphtali, which is in the land of Naphtali, which is the people that are fighting in this story, because he just said he went to Zebulun and Naphtali, and that's the people who are engaged in this, it's, like I said, maybe 12 miles, tops, from where this battle is taking place. So, get back to my place. I didn't say I was quick with it, just that I had it. All right. When they told Sisera, and Sisera's there with his 900 chariots ready to go, they told Sisera that Barak, son of Abnoam, I can't say it anymore, had gone up to Mount Tabor. Sisera summoned from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kadesh River all his men and his 900 chariots fitted with iron. He says, oh boy, here we go. Israelites are getting a little froggy. Let's get our army together. And so he brings in his infantry, he brings in his chariots, he brings in everybody. And he lines them up there by the river across this part of the Jezreel Valley. And he's looking across, and when you're at Mount Carmel by the Kadesh River, you can see Mount Tabor in the distance very clearly. And so he's looking at Mount Tabor going, okay, there's the Israelites. We got a lot of ground between us and them. But when they start coming down, we got them. And so he's waiting for this. And it says, then Deborah said to Barak, go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. So God gave the whole army to him. Didn't say those 10,000 men were so strong. These were guys that probably didn't want to be there much more than Barak. But they trusted in the Lord, and they came down, and they completely routed his army, and Sisera took off on foot. And so from where this battle took place in the area of Mount Tabor, he ran to Kadesh Naphtali by the Sea of Galilee. And he's running on foot. And all he's trying to do is stay ahead of whatever's behind him, because his army's pretty much gone, and the only thing that's going to be chasing him is Israelites. So he keeps hot-footing it down the road. And it said Barak pursued the chariots and his army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, which is the opposite direction. So Barak and his army, after they encountered them, followed them back to the west. Sisera jumped off his chariot, and he took off running to the east. And he's trying to get out of there. And all Sisera's troops fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Remember we talked about Heber just a second there? Well, his wife Jael is sitting there at her tent. And Heber's out doing whatever he's doing with the sheep or whatever. And here along comes Sisera, running like crazy. Now, they don't go into it a lot here, but they touch on it. Sisera had made a pact with the with Heber, the Kenite, the Kenites in general. They weren't really part of the Israelites, so they didn't really have a beef with them. And so they kind of had neutral territory with them. They just let them exist. They could do their shepherding, whatever they wanted to do, and the Canaanites didn't bother them. They just coexisted. And so as Sisera's running down, it says, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the family of Heber the Kenite, Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." And so she says, "Oh, here's a good place to hide. Come into my tent." Opened up the flaps, said, "Run on in there." So he runs in there. Finally, get a little bit of rest, right? And it says, so he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," she said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. Now, see that nice? He said, "Man, I am so thirsty. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. Give me some water." And she goes, "Oh, why not have a glass of warm milk?" Ooh, that does sound kind of good. So he drinks his milk, and he settles down, gets all relaxed. He's under a blanket. He's safe. Nobody can see he's in there. Nobody knows he came in there. Oh, man, I can let my guard down. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone in there?' say no. I'm not home. I'm just going to take my milk. I'm going to take my blankie. I'm going to sit here in the corner, and I'm going to curl up and take a little nap." It says, but Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. That's a splitting headache. In one side, out the other, right into the ground. Boom. So Jael is the one who's credited with killing Sisera. She's the one who gets the glory for this little story, because she's the one who is faithful in accomplishing God's task, not Barak. Oh, after he got the hang of it and realized they were winning, then he got pretty enthusiastic. But at first he goes, not so much. And so God said, "Fine, I've got a way to take care of this." Sisera is still going to die today. It says, just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." "Oh, you're looking for Sisera? He's right inside here. Come on in." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with the tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, before the Israelites. And the hand of the Israelites pressed harder and harder against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. So see, again, once Israel got this judge and got back on the winning side with God, then they all became enthusiastic, and they all started to rebel against Jabin, and they were able to overthrow him. Because God brought them back up, and they started worshiping God. And they followed the advice of God. They followed his decree. They followed his judge. They repented. They came back to him and said, "Oh, man, we're not going to worship these other gods anymore. These gods here, they do nothing for us. So I'm going to set it over here on the back side of this cabinet, and we're going to forget about him," rather than getting rid of it. Rather than turning completely away from them, they still let them linger around. Instead of driving the Canaanites completely out of this land, which they were supposed to do in the first place and didn't get done, and God said, "I'm not going to do it for you." Instead of doing that, they just made sure they broke Jabin's grip on them. And they made sure the Canaanites didn't have any more control over them. Then they were content again. It's okay there's still some Canaanites here. It's okay there's still some foreign gods lingering around. It's okay that those things are in the background, but we're good with God now. We're good. But they never quite got it. So what happens? Well, Deborah dies. And there's no longer a judge sitting there telling them, "This is what you need to do." And they go right back to doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. To doing what they thought was right in their own minds, justifying their sin, justifying their actions, justifying their worshiping of other gods, justifying their alliances with the other people around them, the people who did not honor or worship God, and they justified those alliances and then came back and said, gosh, I don't understand why we feel like God is getting so far away. Same thing we do. And it's always interesting that we think that God is the one who's getting far away. We don't realize that God doesn't move. We're the ones who get pulled away by our thoughts and our actions and our friendships and our alliances and our whatever else. And it's easy for us to turn away from his laws and his decrees and his word. And then we realize we're a long ways away. How did we get way over here? I thought we were right next to God. And that's what the Israelites do. So that is the story of Deborah and Jael. Questions? Comments? Oh yeah. I mean, the movie. If you've seen the movie Grease, they had that hot rod with those little spikes. Yeah, they got that idea from the old chariots. And so, with iron chariots, they would have things that would protrude from the chariots as well as shielding around it. And so, yeah, if you run that into a group of men, they're going to run them over or slice them to bits as they go through. Plus, the guy in the chariots got armaments. Bow and arrow and spear and sword and whatever else. So, I mean, they were designed to destroy people in battle. That's what chariots were made for. And if you had 900 of them out there waiting, that would be pretty daunting. I'll have to tell you, if you're just standing out there with your little shield and sword and going, oh boy, this will be fun. And we don't know exactly what God did to the chariots. They were down in that valley. There are things that we can speculate on. It's farmland valley. Maybe he made the ground mushy. Because you get an overflowing river or you get some rains, chariots are pretty much worthless. Especially when they're covered with iron. They just sink down and become little, doorstops. So it could have been something like that. He could have used a natural occurrence like that. Or God might have just said, make all the wheels fall off. Or make them so the horses get confused and run into each other. We don't know exactly how he did it, but we know that God, not the Israelites, conquered the army of Sisera. Took them out. And Israel was able to go down then and kill every last one of them and drive them away from them because of a judge. Because they listened. I don't know for sure. I don't know if it tells in the next chapter. I bet it does. I don't have it in that, but I've got it right here. Well, it doesn't really say, actually. Oh, for 40 years. They had peace for 40 years. And then we go into Gideon, and they were oppressed for 7. It took 7 years after 40 years of peace. It took 7 years before they finally cried out to God and said, we don't like being oppressed anymore. And we'll talk a lot about Gideon and what happened with him next week. But any other questions? You're all so quiet. You look like you've been running, went into a tent and drank milk. And you know what happens if you do that. Don't ever take the milk. Well, it is kind of surprising, but it's not. We have especially in the Western civilization, we have this stereotype that only the men had any standing in the Bible. And most of that's because the men had the right of inheritance, and because a lot of the stories are based upon the men of that deal. But as you read through Scripture, there are a lot of women who play prominent roles in what happens in Scripture and what goes on. And so it's not just a male chauvinist society, and God is not just some male chauvinist God who's sitting up there going, only men can do this. But for the most part, again, without getting into too deep of it, God called men to be the foundation and the leaders of their family. And so most of the time, we're looking at men who are called to lead their family and lead their clans. Now, in every one of those stories, pretty much there's a woman behind them going, get out there and do what God told you to do. But the men are called. And I think that's still true today. And I know that's not politically correct at all. But guys, you are called to lead your family. And you are called to have a partnership and a relationship with your wife and to support your wife, and she's called to support you. But when it comes right down to it, when God is looking at your family, the judgment's going to fall on your head. Because God's going to say, why didn't you tell the next generation? And so there are many figures, many female figures in the Bible who come up and do everything from judge Israel to we have Rahab, a prostitute who wasn't even an Israelite, who was a key figure coming into Canaan, to, in the New Testament, ladies who led churches in their homes. So it is something that there's a lot of women who are very prominent in Scripture, but men kind of have that key role, and I really think it's because God has called man to be the head of the household from Adam and Eve. Adam and then Eve was created as a helpmate to him, but it's not to say that men are better or men are greater. It's to say we're going to be judged differently a little bit, and God has called us to raise up our families and to be the heads of our families and to lead those families. And we need to be ready to do it. I personally feel that's the way the church is designed as well, is that men are called to take those positions and step up and lead the church. But I also know there's been a lot of churches that if the ladies hadn't stepped up, there wouldn't have been a church at all. Because the men dropped the ball. And they did not do what they were called to do. And thankfully, there were women who God called to come up and serve in those positions to keep the doors open in a lot of churches, or to have churches prosper because they were there to do it. So, there's my little soapbox. It's not politically correct, but it is what the Bible says, and it's what the Bible teaches. And I do believe it's 100% true. That is wisdom. I think that's just good wisdom to say, we need to talk about this. But at the same time, ultimately, it has to come back, and you have to say, you know what, this is what our family's going to do. The what? Well, I'm going to tell you, the saying is very true. Happy wife, happy life. So make decisions there accordingly because, So, or if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. But still, guys, do your part. And that's what we need to teach to the next generation, is for the men to step up and do what they're called to do. Any others? Right. Okay. What? Yeah. No, and I think that's true throughout Scripture, is God repeatedly does not call us to do supernatural things. He calls people to obey and to be obedient and to do what they've been called to do. And the simplest form of that is to obey what he says, to obey his word, to obey his commands, to obey his decrees, to pray, to spend that relationship with him. That's the simplest form of it. Rarely do you have a situation like we're going to get into with Samson, where he says, here's your great stuff. There's some other judges who do some amazing feats. We have one of them that kills 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Now that one, we can debate on that all day too, about was it all at once or was it over a period of time? But nonetheless, there were 600 graves from that dude's ox goad, which is like a cattle prod, over the time of him being a judge. But God didn't say, go kill 600 guys. He said, be faithful. Do what I've called you to do. And then God took care of the rest. And same thing here. Yeah, it wasn't, you on your own power is going to go defeat Sisera. God says, I'm going to go defeat him. I just need you guys to come along. Because you're going to get the credit for this, so it looks better if you're there. But God already had in his mind that they were defeated. He already defeated them. He just needed the Israelites to obey and come along. So, all right. That's good. All right, well, goodbye, people at home. Thanks for watching. See you next week.